So we're excited to have Gordon Burtch. He is the Kelly Questrom Associate Professor of Management and Information Systems at BU. He has extensive work studying information systems and digital platforms, and we're excited to have him here today to talk about the effects of owner online social identity on retail demand. Before we get started, throughout the talk, we'll take clarifying questions through the chat, which I can moderate to Gordon. And to preserve bandwidth, if you don't mind muting yourself and turning off your video. And then at the end of the talk, if there's time left over, we'll ask you to unmute and we can have a little bit more informal discussion. So Gordon, take it away.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. I think that's the case. So thanks very much for the invitation, Alex. I appreciate it. This is relatively new work where we are studying, and this work is joint with one of my former students, Yash Babar, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as Ali Adeli, where we are studying the effects of these online social identity signals that a lot of digital platforms have recently provided to retailers that they can adopt in their online storefront. What I mean about this is essentially things like a Black-owned business label or a woman-owned business label, et cetera. And there are several of these that now exist. So we're trying to understand what is the effect of adopting these labels on retailer performance, with a little bit of eye towards heterogeneity and thinking about when is it a good idea potentially for a retailer to make use of these. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of movement across many different online platforms to adopt these features. A lot of this has been motivated by social movements that have taken place over the last few years. You think about Me Too or Black Lives Matter or the Stop Asian Hate movement, et cetera. It runs the gamut. So basically any major platform you can think of where the retailers have some presence, it's typically the case they have these options. So from TripAdvisor to even TikTok, and where we're going to be focusing, Google and Yelp both provide these options to retailers now. Kind of a quick timeline for you about what's driven a lot of this and sort of what types of labels are now out there and available to retailers to adopt. So this all kind of started around 2018, as I mentioned, and Google led the way initially with the women-led business label that they introduced. This is specifically something that can be adopted on Google Places in a business profile. Several labels followed, going through 2020 when we see Black-owned business labels really around the time of the Black Lives Matter movement taking off. And then most recently, the Asian-owned business label on Yelp following the Stop Asian Hate protests. So when we're thinking about what role might these features play in determining retailer performance or retailer demand, there's actually some relevant prior literature that deals with related topics. A lot of this literature has been thinking about offline factors. So if I'm running a restaurant and I adopt decor in the restaurant that signals something about my my ethnicity. If I adopt decor that's sort of Italian in nature, there's research that shows that that affects the things that consumers choose off my menu experimentally. I'm more likely to pick the Italian-oriented dishes because presumably quality inferences happen around this, for instance. There's also research which shows that if I convey a signal that my business is family-owned, that drives a perception of authenticity. And as a result, people perceive the business as more credible and they're more likely to consume or patronize that business. More recently in the IS literature, we have some work looking at this on the consumer side as well, the role of social identity signals, particularly signals of LGBTQ plus status, for example, and how that affects your ability to obtain services from a third-party provider, in that case, Uber. When it comes to the labels that we're focused on here in particular, right? So when we will be focusing on the Black-owned and women-owned business labels. There is a little bit of prior work that touches on these, which has come up in the last year or two. One in particular, a paper in tourism management, which is focused on what happens to online ratings that businesses receive after they adopt specifically the Black-owned business label on Yelp. That work shows some evidence that ratings and sentiment in ratings and volumes of ratings all rise, although a lot of it is temporary. However, some persistent effects exist in terms of the sentiment of the text that people are using towards a business. What we're looking at here is not just ratings, we're looking at actual demand that arises. And we're thinking a little bit more deeply about mechanisms by which these influences could be happening. So number one, this label adoption could be having an effect on demand because it reduces search frictions. The reason being that a lot of consumers that are potentially looking to support these businesses may go on a platform and run a search, and they may use these features these as a part of a query to look for a business. So people may actively look for a Black-owned business, for example, on Yelp. And the label enables that to show up in the search results. It may also be, as I noted a minute ago from some prior literature, that the presence of these labels may affect quality inferences that people make. So someone may perceive that a restaurant that sells a certain sort of cuisine that's associated with a particular ethnicity, that if the owner is of that ethnicity, the quality will be better, for instance, quite simply. Right? The other thing that could be going on is that people are looking for these places. We want to think about why people are looking for places with a particular label if they are, doing this self-directed search. It could be that they're looking for places where they think other people like them will go. So there could be a sort of a homophily component to this. There could also be some role of people's politics and the social movements involved, because they may perceive the labels as implicit support for a particular social movement. And if they agree with that movement, they may react positively to the presence of the label. And if they disagree with the movement, they may react negatively to it. So there's a lot of different things that could be going on under the hood in terms of driving whether and when these labels drive benefits for a particular retailer. And so we're going to try and piece some of that apart. Okay, so this is sort of a broader research question in this study. When does social identity signaling help or hinder? And this is specifically online social identity signaling for businesses. So the promise, consumers who support the cause can actively support them by finding them more easily. There may be positive quality inferences that could happen. It could enable homophilous consumers to locate venues where they feel more comfortable. The downsides, political opposition to these causes or negative quality inferences could result in lowered demand. So before we jump into any of our analyses, I can tell you what the platforms are kind of saying. Yelp, for example, published an analysis following their introduction of various labels, what the value is of these labels for the retailers who've adopted them. And they sort of claim that across the board, all of these labels drives relatively large increases in demand that the retailers experience. Now, there's lots of reasons by which we might question these results. Obviously, the labels are not being randomly assigned to restaurants. There's a lot of self-selection that could be going on. It's also not clear what the counterfactual is as a result. So we have this sort of anecdotal, superficial indication that things are helping generally, and that seems intuitively like it might be true, but it may not be, okay? So we need a better sort of causal design to think about these things. So how am I going to tackle this? So we actually had some multi-method study. We have two parts to this. So the first thing that we're going to do, we run a controlled experiment with 1,200 people on Prolific. And what we do is we take Google Places business profiles, actual profiles, for a set of a little more than 50 restaurants in Chicago. And we're going to randomly incorporate the Black-owned or women-owned business label and ask people to provide sort of evaluations consistent with like a TripAdvisor multidimensional rating scale, where they talk about expectations of quality on different dimensions. And they also give some indication about their likely willingness to visit the place and their belief that other people would be willing to visit this place. We're gonna strategically sample subjects here to be able to test some of the mechanisms we think might be at play, specifically homophily and homophily in gender and in race. And we also collect a little bit of information on people's political leanings to get a sense of how that moderates responses too. Part two, we're then going to turn, because obviously the controlled experiment isn't necessarily externally valid, and we're getting sort of expectations and beliefs from people as opposed to real spend data. We're going to turn to an archival analysis where we're going to combine data from Yelp on retailers' adoption of these labels, specifically for restaurants, and we're going to marry this with data from SafeGraph about mobile foot traffic, mobile patterns, their mobile patterns data set, which provide estimates of foot traffic on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, to see what happens to actual foot traffic estimates following the adoption of the labels. And again, we're going to dig into heterogeneity there by looking at the characteristics of the people who are visiting these businesses before versus after they adopt the labels. Just to make sure you get to hear all of my conclusions in case I end up running out of time because I'm rambling or something. Study one, with the controlled experiment, basically what we're going to show is that we only find significant average effects from the Black-owned business label. This label has significant positive effects on virtually every characteristic we ask people to respond to. So this includes people's own expressed interest in visiting the place or claimed willingness to visit a place, beliefs that others will go, as well as reports on expected quality of the food, the service, and the atmosphere that they would expect to experience at the restaurant. These effects are really heterogeneous, so we're going to show the effects are much stronger among Black subjects, female subjects, and also people who report being politically left-leaning. We'll then turn to our archival analysis, where we will again show significant positive relationship between the adoption of Black-owned and the women-owned business labels in terms of foot traffic volumes. And again, we're going to show heterogeneity there. We're going to show consistent results in that a lot of the visits are largely deriving from people who come from census block groups that are majority Democrat, i.e. left-leaning. However, the effects are actually also more pronounced when the restaurant itself is located in a neighborhood that is heavily right-leaning and majority white. The argument or explanation being that this is a location where there's more opportunity to inform consumers, where it may be less expected, for example, or intuitive that a restaurant, for instance, would be Black-owned, as opposed to, say, a majority Black neighborhood. Okay, so controlled experiment first. So our design here, this is a 2x2 full factorial experiment. We recruit 1,200 subjects on Prolific. They are stratified from the subject pool, so they're purposefully sampled to have 300 of each group cross between gender and race, Black versus white. So we get people self-reported as being, 300 of them are self-reported male, self-reported white. Similarly, we'll have 300 self-reported female, self-reported Black, etc. You get the point. In order to facilitate a relatively large sample, we end up doing a within subjects design here. So essentially, for each of these people, we're going to show them 16 different business profiles that are drawn at random from the set of profiles that we curated from Chicago restaurants. And then across these profiles, we randomly include or exclude the labels in question. And we ask them to provide these ratings across all of them. At the very end of the design, the very last questions, because we didn't want to prime them to get a sense about what we were looking at, we asked them political leanings at the very end of the survey.
A quick clarification.
Sure.
Are these restaurants all restaurants that have had a tag on them, or do you randomly add the tag to some restaurants that don't have them at all? I'm just wondering, how do we select the restaurants?
So we basically curated a list to have balance on all of these things. So it's actually 50% of the restaurants are actually Black owned, 50% are actually women owned, et cetera. In terms of the presence of the labels, I don't recall now, to be honest, which of them had them and which did not. So I don't want to comment on that. But those that did have them, like for sure, even if some of these did have them in place, we are removing them at random or incorporating them at random. So we basically wipe it out and then decide at random whether to put it in or not. So this information, we have balance across conditions in terms of how frequently you see the label showing up or not for both labels, if that makes sense. Okay. So we do a little bit of screening. So subjects that are zipping through the survey, essentially, we end up dropping these people. So if on average, they're spending less than 15 seconds per place to enter their evaluations, we're ditching them. And this is a pre-registered experiment, by the way. So we end up with slightly less than 1,200 people. We end up still with 1,030 people in the sample. And if I check balance on various characteristics about the subjects in terms of where they're located, age, income, their political leaning that they report at the end, or their gender or their race, everything is still very highly balanced in the sample, right? So it doesn't seem like we have a selection issue of any sort from this.
And Mizal has another clarifying question asking you to comment on why you chose the within subject versus the between subject design.
So we would have preferred a between subject design. I'll be candid that the effect sizes we were anticipating on, say, quality inferences and things, we didn't expect them to be particularly large. So we're working with Likert scale responses here, or a variant of that, because it's actually a 5-point scale. And given, it's a survey design, people tend to report 3s on everything. A lot of people are not necessarily going to be that attentive and responsive. We were worried about getting a large sample. If we do a large sample between subjects design, it gets extremely expensive because on a per person basis to recruit you for a task on Prolific, there's a lot of overhead that comes with a single subject recruitment. So it's much cheaper to get more answers from one person than it is to get one answer from more people, if that makes sense. So this did drive our sampling strategy. I mean, we can do an analysis where we try to focus on just the very first response, but it's going to trim our sample size a ton, such that we lose a bunch of power. So a bit of this is convenience driven. Okay, so this is what our treatment looks like for the Black-owned label. That caption you see showing up over the image, considering this Google Places business, indicate that wasn't something they saw. That was actually my cursor was hovering over it on Prolific, and that's the thing that pops up to explain the task. This is what they would see. So we actually took the real Google Places business profile from this business, and we reconstructed them dynamically for subjects to incorporate the label or remove it. And then below at the bottom, you see the questions that we ask people to answer, the extent to which they agree with each statement. So whether the individual would go there, they believe their friends would go there, and then 3 quality dimensions that basically come from TripAdvisor multidimensional rating scales. Belief about the food being good, the service being good, or that the atmosphere would be good. At the very end, as I mentioned, we ask about political leaning. This is a 4-value scale that ranges from very liberal, very somewhat conservative, very conservative. And it's just self-reported measure. So before I jump into like more formal analyses, if we just look at some descriptive kind of results here, the left plot that you see here, we're looking at the responses split between Black subjects and white subjects. And red is you do not have the Black-owned label present, and blue is the Black-owned label is present, and how those two compare. And what we basically see, there's not really a big difference between the treatment and the control for white subjects. Among Black subjects, there's a really big shift that ends up happening on all of these dimensions. The only one that might be an exception among white subjects is the service indicator. I don't know if I would read into that, though. It might just be noise. On the right, if we're looking at the women-owned label, we don't see super strong effects. So this is split between male subjects and female subjects. So again, with an eye towards sort of homophilous response. Male subjects, they actually are slightly less likely to report that they would go to a women-owned business, and they're slightly more believing that the service will be better at a women-owned business. If you look at women's responses, you see the ambiance and the service dimensions are the main places that they're exhibiting some response to this women-owned label. But of course, this is, some arbitrary splitting. So what I'm going to actually do is formalize this a little bit more and do some regression analyses, where I'm also going to try to deal, I can deal with the within subject design a little bit better. So I'm going to throw in fixed effects for the subject, and I can also throw in fixed effects for the place that they're evaluating. Because again, they're taking a random draw. Among our 50 plus places, we give them 16 of them. So we have many repeated observations in both cases. Okay, so this is our regression specification. We have these 5 outcomes that come from their responses, right? And we're modeling all of these as a function of, are you seeing a Black-owned label? Are you seeing a woman-owned label? Are you seeing the combination of the two? And again, I can add in fixed effects for subjects and places here as well. So before I've not added in fixed effects yet, I'll do that in a second. It's not going to change much. We see only the Black-owned business label has a consistent, significant positive effect. This is consistent with what I showed you on the prior plot. Essentially, what's happening is they're slightly more likely to report that they would go. They have much more positive ratings of food, service, and atmosphere expectations. And consistent with what I showed in the plots, the women-owned labels really only driving a marginal effect on beliefs about service quality. Okay. Now, if I add in the fixed effect, we see basically the same thing. So it doesn't really change the results very much. Some slight shifts in significance, but the conclusions don't really move around at all. As I mentioned, the effects here are not huge. So the effect size here, I'll tell you, Cohen's d is less than a 0.2. So it would be considered like below a small effect size. So we are seeing significant movements, but it's just detected by the fact that we have a large sample to be able to detect it. There's like little movements. But again, I don't know how much I read into that because this is sort of self-reported, survey controlled setting. So this is part of why we're going to want to turn to SafeGraph and look a little bit at actual observed consumer behavior too. Before I get there, as I said, we do look at heterogeneity as well. So we're going to look at heterogeneity around both of these labels to see maybe the average effects aren't there, but maybe effects start to pop out, especially when we look at subgroups of respondents. 3 things that we're going to look at. So one, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, we're going to be looking at the role of homophily, demographic homophily. A lot of obvious intuitive explanation for why this would matter. Tons of literature about in-group, out-group dynamics and things like this, that people may have a preference to be in a location where they feel more comfortable with other people like them, et cetera. That'll pop out with the atmosphere dimension of the response, for example. So we're going to look at homophily and demographics. We'll also, at the same time, look at this idea of intersectionality. And here, I don't mean intersectionality in the labels. I'm talking about cross-group support or animosity. So essentially, support from Black subjects for the women-owned business label and vice versa, support from female subjects for the Black-owned business label to see if there is some cross-group support that shows up. And then we will look at political leanings to see if people's self-stated political leaning moderates their response to these labels, again, indicative of their support for or the social movements that are sort of implicitly underlying the presence of these labels, or their aversion to those social movements. So this is how we ask the question about political leaning. As I mentioned, it's this 4-point scale that goes from very liberal to very conservative. There are a few other recent papers in the management literature that have been starting to think about how people's political values or political leanings affect things like who they're willing to work for or how they respond to advertisers who try to take advantage of social movements and things like this. So we are contributing a little bit with this study to this stream of literature, which is fairly new. We find significant effects across all of these moderators for the Black-owned business label. So how conservative you are. So I want to just to refresh, this is a 4-point ordinal value, and the reference here is very liberal. So as you move right from very liberal, the effects of the Black-owned business label get increasingly negative. If you are a Black subject, you respond systematically more positively. If you are a female subject, you respond systematically more positively. Okay, so we do find all 3 things are sort of with what we would expect to see, that political leanings, more liberal people are supportive of these things. Black subjects, you see the homophily effect. Female subjects, you're seeing cross-group support. Now, when we turn to the women-owned business label, we still have that significant positive effect really only on the service dimension. We don't see any heterogeneity here at all. So subjects basically are not responsive to the women-owned business label, regardless of who they are in any of these dimensions. Okay. So that's the controlled experiment. Now we're going to turn to SafeGraph, archival analysis, and get a sense of, do these things generalize to the real world? So what did we do? We constructed a sample. We basically snowball sampled through a scraping exercise using Google and Yelp to identify a bunch of retail restaurants, bars, and cafes in 3 major cities. We're really going to be focusing on Chicago here again, But we do have a broader sample where we do have some indication of Black ownership, like actual Black ownership, regardless of label adoption across the 3 cities. However, we zoom in on Chicago because we ultimately had to do a fair amount of manual coding effort to identify with assurance which of these businesses were women owned and which of these businesses were Black owned, the combination of the two, because there weren't great public resources to identify true ownership characteristics, demographics of owners. So we had to hire coders to go through and kind of research this information on a retailer by retailer basis. Why we did that, it will be, I'll explain in a second, but it's kind of important for the inferences we draw in thinking about counterfactuals. So we identify a set of restaurants in these 3 cities, a little more between 1 and 2,000 in each city. And we marry in SafeGraph estimates of mobile foot traffic arriving at these retailers over time, around the time that the labels were introduced on Yelp. We have about 42 million visits across these places over the course of our panel, which spans 2018 to 2022. These are about 210,000 monthly observations across all the retailers. I can go into a bit of detail about SafeGraph data. I don't know how, I mean, among probably all the groups I could present this paper to, probably IDE group is the one that has the most people that have been working with SafeGraph data, especially related to COVID in the last couple of years. In case you're not familiar, SafeGraph publishes and sells data from a panel of mobile phone users in the United States. They basically collect sort of GPS pings from people's phones on the basis of, for instance, Apple IDFA, and as well as working with third-party advertisers and mobile phone operators to do some data aggregation for individuals that are in these people's sample, and then build trajectories of where these people go, and then they map pings, GPS pings, to locations. And the locations are mapped using basically polygons that identify buildings from satellite imagery, and they have some underlying black box predictive models that associate enough cluster of pings around a location to a visit at a building or a place key. And they map in other information in this prediction that has to do with, for example, the hours of operation. So if I'm sitting in front of a Target, a Walmart, and a bar, and it's 2 a.m., they're more likely to associate that visit to the bar than they are to associate it to Target or Walmart, for example. Okay. We don't get the raw visits at the individual level. The data comes aggregated. So we get visit volumes generally in a particular time period. However, we will have the ability to break those visits apart into subgroups based on the home census block group where the visitor comes from, where they reside, which tells us something. We can use census demographics from that location to say something about the individuals in a noisy way that are coming. So it's a difference in differences estimation that we're going to adopt. Now, this gets a little bit messy to think about because there's a lot of selection that can be going on. So essentially, we don't want to focus too heavily on the timing of label adoption because that can be highly self-selected. It's obviously very clearly entirely the choice of the business, whether and when they adopt these labels. Of course, we're going to have an issue broadly with this still, but we focus instead on the platform's decision to introduce these labels. That said, we're still crossing this with the ultimate eventual adoption decision. So I'll admit up front, this is a little bit of a self-selected analysis. That said, our treatment here is, was the label available on the platform or not on Yelp? And by the end of our sample, when we scraped your retailer page, did you have the label activated? Okay. At best, this is something like an ATT, okay, if we ignore selection issues or hope that we can deal with them. But this is the estimation we're going to provide. So I'm going to do multiple samples here, as I mentioned. So we're going to start off with the 3-city sample, and then we're going to pare the sample down a bit to focus on subgroups of retailers who meet certain conditions. An obvious thing to worry about if we're thinking about the effect of these labels is what's the appropriate counterfactual. It doesn't necessarily make sense to think about how these businesses compare to, for example, a white-owned business if I'm adopting the Black-owned label, because a white-owned business, in theory, assuming the honor system, doesn't have the ability to adopt this label. Generally, I think it's true that white-owned businesses are not adopting these labels, although there have been some small media reports catching people lying and saying that they're Black-owned, for example, when they're not. Okay, so our counterfactual that we're really going to focus on in the end is going to be, for instance, for Black-owned label, are you a Black-owned business? And then did you adopt, for instance? Similarly, for the women-owned label, are you a women-owned business? And then among those, what's the effect of adopting? And that's where we're going to get to eventually. Here is the estimating equation, right? So we're regressing visit volumes on the treatment that I defined a second ago. So the presence of the label crossed with was the label available on the platform at the point in time the observation took place. So eventual adoption crossed with that. We're going to have place key fixed effects in here. And then we're also going to have city cross time fixed effects. This latter city cross time thing is only relevant for the 3-city analysis. When I go to the Chicago analysis, it'll just be time fixed effects. Okay, so this is just rehashing everything I just explained to you a second ago about how we need to be worried about purposefully sampling Black-owned and women-owned places when we do these analyses to get a true sense of what it means to adopt the label. In terms of how we identify those, so again, we hired coders, as I said. So the way we did this, so a couple of things. Number one, we go to objective records of business owner demographics. So for example, if there is a Black Chamber of Commerce in the city and all 3 of them had one of those, we could go to the list of registered businesses with the Black Chamber of Commerce and identify from that list what restaurants or cafes or bars in our sample appear. And now we know with some surety that it's actually Black owned, regardless of whether the label shows up or not. Similarly, that's harder to do with women-owned businesses because there's fewer resources like that. But what we complement this exercise with is actually manually inspecting the business profiles, going to the website for the business if one's available, and looking at the about information and like the history of the retailer, for example, and who founded it, et cetera, looking at photos, et cetera, of the owners and stuff. If we can get some surety, basically coders would identify, yes, this looks like it's at least 51% women owned, for example, or at least 51% Black owned, et cetera, as our criteria. We went through a trial exercise with the coders, revisited with them to kind of make sure what they were doing was making sense. And then we kind of let them go nuts to finish the coding exercise. And what we end up with in Chicago are several hundred listings that we know to be Black owned, several hundred that we know to be women owned. And then in each group, we basically see that 5 to 10% of them are adopting one of these labels. So this is just a baseline sort of simple difference in difference. And again, this is not staggered treatment again, right? So we don't have any of those recent issues with this analysis, at least that have cropped up in the literature around staggered treatments and 2-way fixed effects. So this is shingle shock. When did the label get introduced and do I eventually adopt? The Black-owned business label, in the whole sample, we don't see a significant effect. In the Chicago only sample, we don't see a significant effect. The women-owned label we do in the Chicago sample. When we go to the Chicago purposefully sampled on the basis of actual owner demographics, now we start to see positive significant effects of the Black-owned business label. So relative to other Black-owned restaurants that did not adopt this label, these ones are doing better, the ones that did adopt. Similarly, in the strictly women-owned sample in Chicago, businesses that did adopt the women-owned label are doing better than other women-owned businesses that did not. This says something about underlying differences between performance of white versus Black-owned businesses, for example. If you look at the whole sample and you don't see effects there, which I'm not really commenting on for this study, but I think this kind of speaks to some underlying dynamics of the point that I was making that we need to be strategic in our sampling criteria. Now, if I try to estimate the dynamics of these labels, sort of where are the effects showing up and do they persist over time? Do they go away? So all I'm doing here when I run this estimation, I'm basically taking the timing indicator and I'm basically interacting my time dummies with the treatment indicator. And so everything is estimated relative to this like one dummy that collapses everything that was going on more than 18 months before the label showed up on Yelp and the eventual adoption. And so basically we see no real effects, but then with the Black-owned label, you actually see effects start several months before the treatment event, which again is speaking a little bit to the fact that there's self-selection going on. So essentially the adopters may have been revealing this information in other ways on the platform, like maybe they were putting it into marketing materials or they were putting it into their profile somewhere, or maybe other consumers started to mention that this was a Black-owned business in the reviews, for example. So that's obviously a bit of an issue with the Black-owned label in terms of what we can say about the main effects, although we will get to heterogeneity, which I think is a little bit more safe to think about. When we look at the women-owned label, that effect is really only starting sharply kind of right around the time the label showed up. I have a bit more confidence that this is strictly due to the label's presence on the retailer's page, although of course selection can still be somewhat of an issue. In both cases, the effects kind of come, and it looks like they're sort of starting to weaken as time goes on. I'll note that this is actually consistent with trends that have been observed in the broader social movements for like BLM and Me Too. The women-owned label effect is persisting longer. That's actually consistent with the Me Too movement support politically, like generally in society. BLM has also started to fade with time. There's some Pew reports that have been documenting this, and a simple search on Google Trends shows a similar pattern actually. Now, again, like I said, the heterogeneity is probably the better thing to focus on with these analyses, just because of the possibility that self-selection plays a role in the average effects. So the first thing to think about is like, who is actually, so given I am a Black-owned business, given I am a women-owned business, where do I tend to locate? And the reason this is interesting to think about is that it can speak somewhat to the potential for like an informational awareness-based mechanism from these labels being present on a retailer's page. Essentially, if I am a Black-owned business in a neighborhood that is 100% Black, that's not really going to be surprising to anybody. And I'm not sure that you're really going to see the same kind of positive effects. Similarly, you may not get any competitive benefits from that situation because saying you're Black-owned doesn't really distinguish you necessarily from competition. With female ownership, it's a bit different because actually gender tends to be quite balanced across census regions, regardless of where you look. So you're never really going to have a situation where it's high female or low female in a particular location, but you do get a lot of variation in politics. So when we look at these two demographics of business owners in our data, Black owners are systematically more likely to be located in neighborhoods that are Black. That's not surprising. And this is using data from American Community Survey about census block groups where these retailers are located, right? The demographics of that census block group. Black owners tend to be located in Black populated areas. They're also more likely to be located in places that are liberal. And how is this measure calculated? There are some estimates from some people in political science that they generated these based on overlap between voting districts and census block group boundaries. And they have there's some predictive modeling that they do. I'm not going to go into it here, but basically these are estimated distributions of Democrat versus Republican versus Libertarian versus other voters in a census block group from the 2020 election. So basically, if you have a more liberal population, that means you had more people predicted to have been Democrat voters in the election of 2020. And so Black-owned businesses are more likely to be located in liberal-leaning or Democrat voting census block groups as well. Locations with less money, no differences really in terms of the type of place this is, whether it's fast food, sit-down restaurant, or like a snack bar. Female owners are more likely to be located in Black populated neighborhoods. They're much more likely to be located in liberal populated neighborhoods, and they tend to be more wealthy neighborhoods. So when we think about heterogeneity in terms of where are the effects strongest based on the characteristics of the place the retailer is located, we'll think about both of these aspects: the racial composition of where my business is located, the local neighborhood, as well as the political composition. And what we actually see, the Black-owned business label has weaker effects in predominantly Democrat populated neighborhoods. The effects are stronger in right-leaning neighborhoods. They're also stronger in predominantly white neighborhoods. This is consistent. So the white-leaning thing, I mean, or the predominantly white neighborhood moderating effect, you could interpret this as, this is where I get the most signaling benefit. You could also interpret it as, this is where I get the most competitive benefit because I distinguish myself from other restaurants. The Democrat leaning thing, that doesn't really work the same way. I mean, there's not really a great reason for thinking, why would a Republican dominated neighborhood drive better benefits for me having one of these labels in place, aside from the signaling story, the informativeness story, that people who want to go to a Black-owned place, they need this information more when the place is located in a Republican dominated location because it's rare and it's harder to find potentially. Okay, now, the other story you could think about is that maybe the reason the effects are bigger in a predominantly white neighborhood is that the people who are coming are white. Now, I'm going to negate that story in a minute when we start looking at the characteristics of the visitors themselves. We don't see clear evidence that that's true, that it is white people that are more likely to be coming in the presence of these labels. But we do see that Democrats are coming to these Republican neighborhoods. We'll get there in just 1 second. I know I should probably pick up the pace here. I've just got a couple minutes. So thinking about who is adopting the label, because this is kind of important to think about, like, are are retailers doing the thing they maybe should be doing or not, right? In terms of who adopts the Black-owned label, so on this plot, a value far to the right and looking at the blue lines, this is the original unadjusted sample. Adopters are systematically more likely to be placed in higher median income neighborhoods. They're also less likely to adopt if they're located in a Black populated neighborhood. Again, probably because they don't need to distinguish themselves, as we talked about before. Balance and other characteristics. In terms of who's adopting the women on label, we actually don't see that this is correlated too much with characteristics of the local population where the restaurant's located. It's relatively balanced on all of these things. So it's sort of randomly assigned in some sense, conditional, at least among these observables. Note if I reweight based on these, the P propensity score reweighting that would come from this check, it doesn't modify my results. So let's skip that for a second. We're going to now look at, so I showed you moderators by where am I located and the demographics and composition of the place that my retailer is located. Now I'm going to think about characteristics of who is coming in response. Again, SafeGraph tells us for a given group of visitors, so let's say there's 5 visitors out of 20, we know where those 5 people live, their census block group. So based on that, I can do some aggregation and say something about, well, these visitors are more likely to be liberal based on the voting demographic or the voting characteristics of their home census block group. Or I could say these people are more likely to be Black based on the Black composition of their home census block group. It's noisy though, because a lot of aggregation steps and choices have to be made here, and it's a bit subject to garden of forking paths problems. So I'm going to show you with a couple of different definitions. So for example, if you look at my table at the bottom, let's say I'm looking at one retailer and they've got visitors coming from 2 census block groups, and those 2 census block groups have differing demographic compositions and political compositions. And I get this differing number of people coming from each one. And now I have to make a choice, like how am I going to say among the 15 people that came from CBG1, I can't say like, yes, they're Black, right? Because it's only like, you know, a random draw, there's an 80% chance that those people are Black, any one of them. So I could just say, multiply that number by 0.8. And now I'll say that's how many Black visitors came. But obviously that's super arbitrary because people may select out of that CBG on the basis of their characteristics. So the point here I'm making is that it's hard to think about how I should do this aggregation. So what we end up doing is we look at number of visitors coming from a majority Black or number of visitors coming from a majority Democrat CBG. And then we'll do it again and we'll look at number of visitors coming from a super majority Democrat, like more than 60% or more than 60% Black. As our measure, right? To try to get signal from the noise. And what we end up seeing when we do this, so for the Black-owned label, which is shown on the table at the top, the Black-owned label, depending on how I operationalize the racial composition measure from the home CBG, I could either show you that it's more likely to be white people coming, or I could show you it's more likely to be Black people coming. So what I take from this is I really can't say anything good about the race of the people who are visiting. It's kind of arbitrary and subject to what I choose. My experiment, however, would tell you it's probably more likely to be Black people that are coming, assuming it's consistent with these with what's going on in SafeGraph. Now, when I look at politics, here we see a more consistent story. If I'm coming from a majority Republican CBG, voting Republican CBG, or if it's a supermajority Republican CBG, that has negative relationship with the number of visitors who are arriving following label adoption. If I look at, are you coming from a Democrat majority or Democrat supermajority CBG, that has a positive moderating effect. So basically we're seeing more visitors from Democrat home CBGs and fewer visitors from Republican dominated CBGs in response to these labels. Okay, and that again is consistent with our experiment, which showed that conservatism moderates the response to the labels. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap this up because I want to leave some time for questions. So we're informing retailer decision-making about whether, where, and when these labels are likely to benefit demand they experience, and also thinking about who is responsive to these labels and why. There's important things to think about. There's distinction between my experiment and the SafeGraph data. In my experiment, I am pushing this information on people who didn't ask for it. So this is more akin to what might happen, for example, if we were to put these labels into ads. And that's an experiment that we're running right now on Facebook to see what happens to ad performance when we incorporate these labels, which is a bit different because those people are up funnel and they're maybe not even interested at the time you reach out to them in patronizing a business, right, for this service or good. In contrast, on like Yelp or Google Places, those are things that you use for searching for information. So you're already actively looking for something to make a purchase. And so you're in that mindset and you may actively be seeking this information out. So that's quite a different consumer. Okay, so that could be contributing to some differences possibly that we might see between the two settings. The second thing, of course, is implications for platform design. Because all the platforms are adopting these labels, it might inform recommendations that the platforms make if they have some indications of predicted characteristics of the parties doing the searches, for example. It also may say something about, what is the general coaching that you might want to provide to businesses about whether and when they should be adopting these labels. Open questions we're tackling now. So there's several other labels that are out there, and ones that we're particularly interested in looking at are highly politicized ones. In specific, we're going to be looking at veteran-led and LGBTQ plus friendly business labels that Google has now provided. We're running the experiment already. I don't know if this will be the same paper. It may be a separate paper. That is very clearly politically oriented, those two. Also thinking about intersectional identity with respect to adoption of multiple labels and how they may combine with each other. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at this in ads to do the contrast between push and pull. So I will stop there and I can take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gordon. That was great. If anyone has questions, put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. But I'll kick things off. In your first experiment, can you tell me, or can you help us think about this point about homophily and like, how is this, is there any discrimination component of this, or are these sort of the same thing? Like we saw some negative effects in certain groups. Is that discrimination, or do you think that is homophily?
Make sure I'm referring to the same thing that you're referring to. So you said you saw negative effects. Oh, you're talking, so the negative effects I think that only showed up were from political leaning.
Right.
So, and this is conditional on race and everything else. So this is like conditional on subject race, conditional on subject gender. Being more conservative reduces the response. So I don't think that this would be explained by homophily, because this is the distinction between like demographics and race, unless people are maybe making an inference that a Black-owned business is more likely to be a liberal business or something like this, which could be going on, but that's not really how I'm thinking about it. I think this is more, the political orientation thing is more speaking to the mechanism of like support or advocacy or like dispute with the idea of the underlying social movement that kind of underpins the presence of these labels in the first place. I think that's kind of more likely what's going on with that. Homophily is really only coming from, in this case, the Black-owned label, Black subject. That's clearly a homophilous response. And I think, interestingly, what I would have expected with that is that the atmosphere effect would really pop up. Like I would perceive a better atmosphere for me at a Black-owned restaurant if I am Black, because that's kind of the idea about like wanting to be around my own group and things like this. That doesn't actually show up so clearly. It's actually more just quality inferences that appear to be driving it, because its food and service expectations are both said to be better. So it's actually a little bit counter to a homophily story in some sense. It's actually more just that people believe that they're going to get better quality from someone like them, right? So it's not about patronizing the business of someone like me to support them economically or something like that. It's the in-group dynamic piece of it. It's I think you're better because you're like me. And then the cross-group support is actually not homophily. It's more like allyship or something like this is how I think about it.
I see. Thank you. And my Zoom actually froze, so I can't see if there are any questions in the chat. So do you mind taking a peek at that?
Yes. Okay. So me, I don't know if you just want to ask your question. Oh, you already asked this question. Michael's asking, are we looking at size of bills and tips? So in terms of like actual spending data, that's not, so SafeGraph does have spend data now, which we haven't incorporated into this study yet, although in theory we could. What we have been able to look at are things like dwell time. So SafeGraph does provide estimates of how long the visits last and things like this. We don't find any significant effects anywhere on how long people are spending in these locations as a function of the labels. So I can say that, but I don't know for sure what's going on with dollar amounts. Something we still need to incorporate.
One other question I had on the SafeGraph analysis is, there's some interesting heterogeneity based on the like where the business is located. Do you think any of that's driven by COVID restrictions and like heterogeneity in what's open during the time studied?
That is an interesting point. So it's possible that that interacts with the treatment somehow, or this is confounded with the treatment. So one thing I will say, it wouldn't necessarily be policy-based COVID restrictions, because everything in this analysis is within Chicago and there was a single policy in place,
Right.
But it might be compliance with the policy, potentially, that these are places that were less compliant if they're more right-leaning or something like this. I hadn't thought of that. It's a good point.
I see.
I'm trying to think about how we could check. So our data does span 2018 to 2022. So a simple thing I could probably do is just drop the last 2 years of data and see what the effects look like. They may contribute to the result in some way, but they wouldn't explain the experiment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, my
Good
Zoom
point.
is still frozen, so I can't see the chat if anything new came in.
I think that's it for questions in the chat.
Okay.
Gordon, can I make a question? Mikhail here.
Yes, you can.
Okay, nice meeting you again. So clarification question that depending on your answer, that might lead to a question later on. So it's kind of for your diff and diff later on design. You take as a point the introduction of women-led or Black-led from Google, correct?
No, from Yelp, but that is
From
the
Yelp.
general design from
Yeah,
Yelp.
but from Yelp, but also Google later on came up. So this might
They
be
did.
some kind. So this might be a mixing film. So okay, you take the first point later on by Yelp, but later on also it might be your results might be driven also by Google, or how do you disentangle between those two platforms?
Yeah, so what you say is maybe true, that the people that are adopting on Yelp also adopt on Google. I guess my response is, I'm not worried about it. So it's sort of like, I'm not saying that this is a Yelp effect. I'm saying this is a self-identification effect. So to the extent that this label adoption is correlated with adoption on other platforms, I'm not worried about it. The point is like, yes, you may be right that may be contributing to it, but it's just part of the same mechanism for me. Does that make sense? Because I don't care about Yelp specifically. Yeah.
No. You don't necessarily specifically, but the visits might be driven by this one. So if someone is not identified in Yelp, but it's later identified on Google, this might affect the results.
Sure. I mean, I may be wrong about this, but my intuition is that's just going to create noise in our data, because we'll flag you as treated when you're actually not, and vice versa. So we'll have a harder time detecting the effect. So it might be worth incorporating what you say, just in the interest of precision, at the very least. Yeah, but it's true that I believe, in fact, that they would be adopting on other platforms too. Thanks for the question. Okay.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, I think we can just thank Gordon for the talk. And next week we have the last seminar of the semester, I believe. It's Zoe Cullen. So please tune in. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.